Having set the stage with a general reference to some of the more prominent theories of institutional and new institutional economics, and a brief overview of the concept of the developmental state, let us now turn our attention to what is arguably one of the more peculiar institutional features in both emerging and frontier markets, and that is the notion of so-called institutional voids. If you have not yet had a chance to read the two assigned chapters by Harvard Business School's Tarun Khanna and Krishna Palepu, it might be well worth your time to first read those chapters before proceeding with this video lecture. And if not, then at least build on the general overview provided in this video lecture with a subsequent critical reading of those two chapters, which are drawn from a 2010 Harvard Business Press publication titled Winning in Emerging Markets, a Roadmap for Strategy and Execution. Now, from the perspective of emerging and frontier markets, the concept of institutional voids is uniquely relevant because individuals and companies that are committed to doing business in those markets will inevitably, albeit to varying degrees, have to contend with the possibility of not only weak, but at times non-existent institutional structures. Notwithstanding this reality, the resulting degree and extent of institutional uncertainty in these markets, as I had already alluded to in the previous video, may not necessarily be an insurmountable barrier to entrepreneurship, but rather it might just be the catalyst for aspiring entrepreneurs to try and overcome or bypass institutional weaknesses, inefficiencies, and yes, even glaring absences thereof, thus in effect giving rise to alternative, or at the very least, informal institutions. The obvious question for us, of course, is what exactly constitutes an institutional void? In other words, what is an authoritative definition of this concept? And once we have such a definition, how can we recognize if a particular emerging or frontier market exhibits institutional voids, and if so, in what particular areas? For businesses, awareness and understanding of institutional voids is critical from the perspective of operational efficiency. The individual most directly connected to the concept of institutional voids is Tarun Khanna, the Jorge Paulo Leman professor at the Harvard Business School, who, according to the Harvard Business School website, has established himself as an authority on, quote, entrepreneurship as a means to social and economic development in emerging markets, end quote. Khanna describes institutional voids as essentially, quote, gaps, inefficiencies, or dysfunctional elements in the institutional context of emerging markets that present an impediment to smooth buyer-seller transactions, end quote. It is important to reiterate that the simple existence of institutional voids does not make it impossible to operate in emerging and frontier markets, but it may very well add an additional layer of complexity, especially if businesses fail to appreciate their potential existence, or worse, misunderstand their very nature. This then leads us to our second question, which is how to spot institutional voids. There most certainly is no single best way to approach this challenge. Nonetheless, in both the book that your book chapter readings are drawn from, as well as several Harvard Business Review publications, Khanna has suggested an analytical framework that aims to facilitate this challenge. The framework rests on 5 main pillars. And I want to take just a little bit of time to walk you through the broad outlines of that framework. At a basic level, you want to try and get a basic contextual understanding of the peculiar political and social system that prevails in the specific emerging or frontier market that you might be interested in. To do so, it might be useful, for example, to find out where exactly power is located. Is it centralized or decentralized? If it is more decentralized, who are the individuals or elites at various levels, say provincial or local levels of government, that you might want to or need to connect with. When it comes to the question of centralized or decentralized power, it is also worth mentioning that a nuanced understanding of socio-political and socio-economic realities in the country is critical. I say this because, as the saying goes, what you see is not always what you get. And let me illustrate this with a quick reference to China. From a political geography perspective, China tends to be described as a unitary state, meaning that power is concentrated in a central location, in this case Beijing, and from there, directives and guidances flow to regional and local levels, where supposedly they are unquestionably implemented. In reality, however, China has functioned more like a federal state, whereby provincial and local levels of government are empowered to a significant degree to make decisions somewhat autonomously. This reality is most aptly captured in the Chinese saying, "The mountains are high and the emperor is far away," meaning that the further removed you are from the central location of power, i.e. Beijing, the easier it might be to ignore or at the very least implement central guidelines in a half-hearted manner. Consider, for example, the perennial challenge of intellectual property rights in emerging and frontier markets. China certainly has very strict intellectual property rights protections on the books, and yet at the same time, we are all probably all too aware of the problem of knockoff products, pirated software, and so on in China. And yes, the government has at times significantly cracked down on intellectual property rights violations. But consider for a moment this scenario. You are a local government official, and you are fully aware that in your backyard there are companies that produce knockoff products. Now, if the national guideline is to strictly enforce intellectual property rights protection, you should take steps to close down that factory. There is, however, one fundamental complicating factor. Closing that factory will lead to massive layoffs, and the resulting increase in unemployment is likely to present a non-negligible political problem for you. Consequently, you might take the decision to simply pretend that no knockoff products are being produced in your jurisdiction and just simply look the other way. What this example shows is that institutional structures may very well be there, but so is the void, which manifests itself in the form of lackluster enforcement of relevant laws and regulations, if not outright dismissal thereof. Another country example would be Russia, which from a political geography perspective should function like a federal state. Instead, under Vladimir Putin, Russia has decidedly become a unitary state on the back of Putin's efforts to dramatically re-centralize power, which he has effectively done over the course of the last 22 years that he has been in power. I have highlighted these examples to show you that from a political system, understanding the underlying dynamics is a critical necessity rather than a luxury. You need to identify and cultivate the political connections that might be able to help you navigate hurdles and challenges in emerging and frontier markets. That being said, this also opens the door to the very real possibility of corruption and bribery, which in and of themselves are significant risk factors in emerging and frontier markets as well. And I shall return to a discussion of those risk factors a little bit later. A second pillar is what Khanna describes as quote-unquote openness. Simply put, how open and accommodating are institutional structures in an emerging or frontier market to foreign investment? Are there, for example, specific restrictions governing foreign investment in the industry that you are operating in? One particularly illustrative example that comes to mind is the automotive industry in China. Beginning in the 1980s, when China began to open up to the global economy through its so-called open door policy, foreign car manufacturers gradually began to express interest in establishing a presence in what they anticipated would become one of the global automotive growth markets. Now, from the perspective of openness, a business would want to consider whether it will have the opportunity to establish a wholly foreign-owned enterprise or whether it will be required to engage in a joint venture arrangement. Initial rules and regulations in the Chinese automotive sector restricted foreign car companies to joint venture operations. The underlying rationale was that such arrangements would allow Chinese automotive companies, which were comparatively highly inefficient at the time and technologically backward, and would stand to benefit from technology transfer, to get access to such technology. And as you can imagine, this level of qualified openness to foreign investment invariably also contained significant risk, notably the potential for reverse engineering, if not outright technology theft, by your joint venture partners. The third pillar that Kana discusses is the so-called product markets. Now, from a product perspective, you would not simply want to jump into an emerging or frontier market on account of it having a large and young population, a large percentage of whom you might anticipate could become potential customers. Of course, you want to collect actual market intelligence, including information about average per capita income, people's buying patterns, consumer needs and preferences, etc. So the obvious question that a business would want to answer is, how easy or difficult would it be to collect the relevant consumer data? Are there specific institutional arrangements and structures that might help you in this regard? And if not, how do you overcome that hurdle? Meanwhile, from a manufacturing point of view, you may also want to consider supply chain dynamics to source the necessary components that are needed to produce the consumer products. In this case, you need to conduct a careful and comprehensive market scan to identify potential suppliers that would meet your quality control standards, for example. What alternatives do you have available if the only qualified suppliers are locked into an exclusive supplier relationship with a competitor? These are all questions that you may keep in mind as well. Additionally, you would also want to expand your market analysis into looking at the transportation infrastructure. Now, if your immediate reaction at this point would be to say, well, wait a minute, how does transportation infrastructure relate to product markets? Well, consider the obvious. Producing a product in an emerging or frontier market does not invariably lead to that product ending up in the hands of the customers. The quality and the network of transportation infrastructure is thus critical to ensuring that a product can seamlessly move from its point of production to the point of sale. Labor markets are yet another critical component to include in the institutional voids analytical framework. It may be true that access to cheap labor is what prompted the initial foray into an emerging or frontier market, but it is hardly the only sustainable consideration. In fact, from a medium to long-term perspective, it is much more advisable to also take into account the skill level of workers, as well as their potential for continuous skills development and upgrading. And if you wonder why, consider the simple fact that a competitive advantage based on cheap labor in a particular location is not sustainable, period. Instead, you want to reflect on the institutional breadth and depth of education and factor into overall business and competitive analysis. What is the percentage of the population, for example, that has access to education? Has that percentage grown over time? Or is there at least a potential for it to increase in the future? What is the quality of education? What is the average education level of the population? How about graduation rates? Depending on the quality of education, a business might decide not to expand into a particular country. But if the ready access to a large pool of cheap labor is seemingly irresistible, a business should then at least also consider the costs and benefits of investing in in-house training and education if national educational institutions are unable to equip workers with the requisite breadth and depth of knowledge and skill sets. In extreme cases, it might even lead to an arrangement whereby foreign companies work closely with national governments to build an educational infrastructure that trains the workers for the jobs and skills of tomorrow. Indeed, this is an arrangement that is not all too far-fetched, as it is beginning to happen more often than not in emerging and frontier markets based on similar trends that have been noticed in more developed economies. In Singapore, for example, the Economic Development Board, a government agency whose stated goal is to ensure that the country consistently remains on the competitive and technological frontier, has regularly engaged with foreign companies to identify the critical skill sets that MNCs or multinational companies require. The Economic Development Board then internalizes that feedback and went back to those companies to propose a cooperative arrangement, effectively suggesting, how about you help us build up a cutting-edge training and skills development program, and in return, your company will get priority access to those graduates. In short, it would be a win-win for all parties involved. In looking at capital markets, which is the last pillar in Khanna's analytical framework, you can also get a sense of the institutional development by considering, for example, how easy it is to get access to funds to support a business venture. Aspiring entrepreneurs might find themselves shut out of the formal structure and thus are compelled to look for alternatives. In China, many such individuals in the 1990s found themselves needing to turn to so-called back alley banking to get access to much-needed capital. In short, for our purposes here, the fundamental learning point about institutional voids is that the ability to being able to more or less accurately identifying them is indispensable to managing both overall market potential and underlying risk factors in emerging and frontier markets.